Welcome, travelers. I'm Josh.
And I'm Lee Wanika, and this is Tabletop Journeys, where we will be your not-so-humble guides on the quest for RPG adventures.
All right, welcome everybody. We are back talking more about the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. We're going to be talking Chapter 5, the Creating Campaigns chapter, with a little bit of Greyhawk information in there also. But joined, as I have been for so many of these episodes lately, Mr. Michael Ross, Mr. Lee Wanika Miller. Pleasure, gentlemen. Nice to see you all again. Not that it's been that long. It's been like about 30 minutes since we recorded the last episode. So, Lee Wanika, I started with you last time. So, Michael, let's go to you, sir. Overall impressions of the Creating Campaigns chapter in the DMG.
Pretty good, actually.
Yep.
I think there's a lot of good information in here. Again, keeping in mind this is for someone who maybe have never ran one before at all. I think it says most of the things it needs to say. As I've brought up many times, I kind of wonder about the order sometimes. I think the order that it lays things out, sometimes it seems counterintuitive to me, but maybe that's just my been doing this for a long time brain. I really like the idea of some of the journals or the trackers we've touched on before. I think these are the ones that I've seen so far that actually might be useful compared to some of the others. I really like the discussion about the different flavors of fantasy because that comes up a lot. There's a little primer on all the various settings that you might play, the published ones. But as someone who basically always runs homebrew, I would have liked a little bit more about that and maybe the reasons why someone might choose homebrew over a setting. And I just really wish it would have started with session 0. They finally did name it. I didn't think they did earlier. We talked about that in one of the earlier episodes. They do use the phrase session 0, but I kind of feel like that should have been literally the first thing because for me, session 0 is probably more than maybe what even they are laying out here. So if I'm going to start a new campaign, for example, normally session 0 is also me selling that on my players. Like it's not a guaranteed thing. I don't go and say, hey, this is what I'm running. Who wants to play? Normally, like if I'm running a new campaign, I'll be like, hey, I got an idea. Does this sound interesting to you? And then we'll do like a session 0 for me can be weeks, if not months of texting back and forth, Discords, emails, Zoom calls, where the players kind of help me build out aspects of the campaign and we build characters together. So for me, that session 0 is so much of the game playing stuff for me as a DM that, again, you could take this entire book of like 300 pages and say, this is a session 0 book. I'm like, yeah, that's probably about right. But overall, generally very positive on this chapter.
I totally agree with pretty much everything that you said there. Honestly, I think you're spot on about the trackers. I think that you're spot on about how good a resource this is. I think in particular, the part that really kind of solidified me how good this chapter is was the campaign premise section, specifically talking about. So conversely, when we talked about the adventure chapter just a few minutes ago, it has that bit about like making sure that you weave the players in and or that you plan how the players interact with that adventure. And it's like, no. I let my players tell me that. I'm not going to go ahead and do that. In a full campaign, that is way more important to go ahead and know what your players want and weave them into the entire campaign. And planning a character arc or giving import to a character's arc within your story is super duper important if you're doing a multi-session long-term game. It's just important. Like, you've got to go ahead and give those players something to latch onto so that they feel like their characters are changing throughout the story. I won't spoil the reason why, but basically all of my players in my home game, their character arcs are woven in in a way that cannot be removed from the entirety of the story that I am running. Like, literally, when they get to levels like 12, 13, and 14, they will be figuring things out about who they are as characters and why they are there. And I can't wait get them there. So but yeah, I totally agree. I think, my comment on this chapter was that it was another excellent chapter, like chapter 4, but really that this entire chapter needs to be a book unto its own. Like there's so much, it is just a little superficial.
It's a primer on
It's a primer, yeah.
campaign,
Yeah.
not the definitive go-to.
But we need an entire book on how to go ahead and make campaigns, honestly. And I'm sure that there are
there's
books out there. I'm sure, I'm sure that someone's got one out there, but that's what this really needs to be.
From my notes, good advice on how to end a campaign. Also from my notes, a solid primer.
Okay, so that's our show then.
Yeah, that's our show. Good night, all. Yep. No, without copying or reiterating all the things you said, I will expand on the campaign journals. I think there was one thing that I think could have been a little bit better, and I didn't know it when I first read it. I didn't know it when I read it for research for this episode, but now that I've heard Josh's answer, I now know it. In the campaign journals, there needs to be a page 3 or page 2 or page whatever that has a half page for bullet points or key elements of each player character's arc.
They have an entire character tracker page.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so then okay. So with the character tracker, then I think that definitely needs to be, if I'm building a campaign notebook, which after reading this book is something that I'm going to start doing, it's going to have the campaign tracker. It's going to have all these trackers that we're talking about in there specifically. So I have those notes and the NPC trackers, because what's the one thing that I often forget with running NPCs is their names. Sure. So great advice on how to do that. A great tracker for that. Michael made the point a couple episodes ago that do I love the cutesy pictures? Probably not so much, but the information itself is really, really solid for sometimes more info than I would need for a starting NPC. But I would definitely say the second time an NPC appears in my campaign, I need to be jotting it down in some kind of fashion. And these trackers are a great reminder. This harkens back to an old first edition product that they have, and I can't remember the exact name, but it was basically Campaign Builder, and it basically had a one solid sheet where you would put everything for that. They even had like a little map tracker, or basically so you could make a campaign flow chart in a little box in the left-hand corner. And it was that old first edition D&D thing where you have this old wizened wizard DM kind of type with his hands outstretched over the curvature of the earth kind of image. And the design, and that thing might have been 15 or 16, 17 pages, and they were blank pages that you would copy at your local library or whatever, because nobody had their own printers back then. But you would get copies of that so that you could use that as your adventure tracker. And if I recall, that was a relatively cheap product because it was mostly blank spaces and a couple things that told you what kind of examples of what you would be filling in. And the idea was to keep buying it. So every campaign you ran, you would buy that thing. And this seems like this chapter is borrowing a lot from that old product, or maybe that is such good DM advice that this is just the latest visual look at it. And I think it's great.
Yep. I will say the one thing that, as I was reading this chapter, that I really wanted to dislike was the table where it describes the various D&D settings. I took one look at that table and I was like, oh, there's no way that they're going to sum up Dark Sun in one sentence. And then I read it. Heroes make their mark on a post-apocalyptic world defiled by magic and forsaken by the gods. I'm like, nope, that's actually pretty accurate. Actually, that's pretty well spot on. I guess we yeah. So I really wanted to hate that table, but honestly, for a 1 or 2 second blurb about all the settings, I think they got them right. I think they got them pretty well. And I think that it did what it needed to do, right? It, like, as a DM, if I'm planning a campaign and I'm trying to figure out what's my setting going to be like, not even necessarily what my setting is going to be, because I'm not necessarily going to set it in Dark Sun, but I'm like, ooh, post-apocalyptic, forsaken by the gods. Well, so maybe I can go grab some of my Dark Sun stuff and I can think about that, yep. Or I can grab some stuff off Drive Through RPG for Dark Sun or whatever, or, if I want to go ahead and do the kind of the gothy, I can go with Ravenloft or whatever like that, so I really wanted to dislike that table, but I actually thought it was pretty good. So, yeah.
I loved those types of elements within this chapter. I think this did a good job of saying, hey, string together your adventures, but if you have a general theme, now you're talking about a campaign.
Yep.
A series of one-shots is not truly a campaign. A series of one-shots with a theme and a central core of characters is definitively a campaign.
Yep.
I find it not, I guess, of note is how I was. I thought it was notable that this is a basically homebrew. Like a lot of the information is about homebrew version of a campaign, where there's a one paragraph about using a published adventure. I kind of feel like this would have been a good part for them to say, hey, here's like Lost Mine of Phandelver, for example. Maybe the first time you run a campaign, you do that. Because I think as an adventure, I think running your first adventure, just making up your own kind of works. I think running your first campaign, maybe you should use a book. Even if like 3 sessions in, you throw the book over your shoulder. I don't know. I kind of feel like, I don't know. I think it's weird. Just not weird, just of note. But the one thing that I do want to say is, because we had a lot about building out your world, all very cool. We got the Greyhawk stuff, great example. If you, dear listener, are wanting to run a campaign that is a homebrew, for your first session, all you need is one location, 1 or 2 NPCs, and something that happens.
Yep.
That's it. You do not need to have all of this done before you start playing. Greyhawk did not exist like this before they started playing in it. Forgotten Realms did not exist like it does today before they started playing in it. It's okay to build as you go. In fact, I think that's the best way
to do it. Yeah.
Right. So do not feel like, the other thing I'll say before I shut up is, for a lot of us DMs, the act of creating is fun. So if you enjoy world building, then absolutely world build, do your thing, but understand that 90% of what you create will probably never matter at the table. So if you're doing it for you, yes. If you're doing it for your table, you may want to spend your time differently, because it might be wasted effort. But as long as it's fun to you, it's not wasted effort, if that makes sense. I said that terribly.
It totally makes sense. I'm actually going to go ahead and take that a step further, because the last time that I ran a in-person game, it started in it was pre-pandemic. So that tells you how long ago it was. It was one of those things, like, I had decided that, like, the world that I had been building half in my head and half on paper for like the better part of 20 years, that I was finally gonna play a game in that world. And man alive, every single session was like, it was like a Kenny Rogers greatest hits album. Like, you had to go ahead and make sure you hit Lady, you had to go and actually hit the Gambler, like, you had to go ahead and hit all these locations that were so personal to me, but the players did not care. I was going to say something else, but they did not care.
They didn't give a
flying.
Correct. Yeah. So, it made no sense to them why they were doing all these things, but I was like, isn't this cool? No, it wasn't.
Yeah.
So
it wasn't that cool. So, and I wasn't at that table, and I probably, because I've known Josh for almost the entire time he was planning it, would have thought it was cool because I was with him.
Because you were there. Exactly. Yeah.
I was present when he was like, "Ooh, I should do this," or like, "I would love to do that in the campaign." I'm like, "I remember when you had that idea." I, having been there all throughout, would have found it different than I think most of your players.
Sure.
That's so there's that. And I think you two illuminate an amazing point. I have run 2 campaigns, 1 D&D. Correction. I've run 3 campaigns, 1 D&D, 1 in Rifts, and 1 that we are currently running in Star Trek Adventures, that I have found, my players have found everything that we've done, every area we've gone to, exceptionally cool. And the reason that worked in only those 3, and I have probably run 40 or 50 different campaigns in my life. And I can add a 4th if you include LARP, because Shadows of Power, the Vampire LARP, versus the problems I had with Legacies of Power, the Werewolf, is, even though that came second, that's an example of what went wrong, right? So the times where it went perfectly, where my players loved all the things I loved, were because I started here and built out, but only built out in the directions they said I want to go. Yep. I had, for those campaigns that went well, mastered the art of and we finish what we're doing, and I have 5 different adventure seeds. What are you doing next? And then I had the next week in between or 2 weeks in between to write the next thing. And then I got to do that thing. So that campaign expanded only in the directions the players chose to go. Yeah. And therefore, everything that they did was the thing that they were looking for and was awesome.
Yeah. Kind of
there
was more. Yeah.
And I think when I learned that skill, and it's a skill that I learned, forgot about, and ran some bad ones, and then had to do another one, and so on and so forth. Like, I tried this great campaign, which was, these people are going to go from here to here, and I got this happen, and they'll get there in this time frame. Garbage. It was a bad campaign. Cool elements within it, terribly run campaign, terribly conceived gaming campaign. It would make for an amazing story, a la Snowpiercer. That was just a modern version of the D&D thing I was trying to do there. But it was bad because I was directing it. When the players direct your direction and you build only where they direct you to go, your players will be more invested. They will have more fun. You will have more fun. And you have no wasted effort.
Right. And to circle what we said before about like railroading is, which again, I don't think is as bad as some people, depends on how you do it. But if I spend all this time crafting this really cool location, I kind of want them to go there. And in fact, if they don't go there, I might be like, we can't play this week. I thought you were going to go there. That's all I did was plan this location, and I'm not going to make you go there. But if you don't go there, I have nothing for us to do. So you're more likely to railroad them to go there. But if you're just like, and to Leonica's point, I do that a lot too. It's like, okay, we ended the session here. Where do you think you're going to go next? And you learned about the temple, and you learned about this maybe, hermit in the woods who might have saw something. Do you know which way you're going to go? And I might prep heavier in that direction, but I still leave a little room here. But absolutely, like you should have a Greyhawk at the end of your campaign. You do not need a Greyhawk at the start of your campaign.
And I think that's a great segue to go into the Greyhawk piece of this chapter. And I think because Greyhawk was built in we start here, work out. It started with a dungeon. It expanded to the Castle Greyhawk. It expanded to the Free City of Greyhawk. It expanded to the other areas, and things were built as the players who played in Gygax's and Arneson's original games or whatever expanded outward. And then they incorporated other things and brought in writers and became official. That's how Greyhawk was built. And as a player who played Greyhawk from as early as 83, 84, and 85, I can tell you that we picked up an adventure that somebody pegged in a specific spot, the Yeomanry, and that's where we did. So we only bought modules or only played modules that surrounded the Yeomanry. We basically didn't get out of that area, and all of our first campaigns were just there. It was the second and third campaigns that explored all the islands to the southeast, and then explored towards the Free City Greyhawk. I played in Greyhawk for probably 5 or 6 years without ever having to go to Greyhawk, because that's not where we started.
Yeah.
And then we had bypassed Greyhawk and went to the deserts on the other side of it and did other things like Pharaoh and all the other cool stuff, and just avoided Greyhawk because didn't interest us. It was just too built out. We couldn't make it our own. In fact, I know the exact spot on the Greyhawk map where one of our factions, the Thundersworn, was born. And I was excited to have this book because I could go right to the spot and say, that's where that came up in the campaign where they were built 40 years ago.
So go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So one thing about planning an existing campaign like Greyhawk or Forgotten Realms, which has been kind of the standard for a long time, is there's a lot of lore that can be well known by your players. And so it helps them immerse themselves in the story. You don't have to explain everything. Here's what Harpers are. Here's what this is. You're going to Waterdeep. Like, if they already know a lot of those things, it can sort of shorthand so you can get more in depth in the lore without actually having to give like a 3-page reading of it every time, like box text before you get there. The other side of that, though, is that these worlds have existed in such detail. You may have players who know things that have happened in the world that you don't even know about. So you're like, oh, well, this happened. And they're like, well, no, it didn't, because the lore, the established lore is this. And as DMs, obviously you can do whatever you want, but the benefit of having all that lore can sometimes actually be outweighed by the weight of that lore that you then have to adhere to, or the players who know, or who are so excited about it because they know all about Waterdeep, when suddenly you're like, this new faction arrived. Like, well, no, because I have a whole novel I read that faction doesn't happen till next year, type of a thing. So it's just, weigh the pluses and minuses of using a campaign or not.
Yeah.
The last thing I'll say on this is I'm a fan of Eberron. I've said it many times, it's my favorite campaign. And of course, you can always do whatever you want. But two of the conceits of Eberron that I enjoy, one is it always resets. So you might play, when you start an Eberron campaign, here's when it starts in relation to this world event. So each time you play it, it is your world. There is no established lore after that point. There is an established history that leads to that point. The other thing in Eberron is like the most powerful NPCs you will come across are like 5th, 6th level tops. Yeah. So by the time you are cool, doing cool stuff, you're the hero. There's no Elminster that's going to come save the day because you're more powerful than anybody else in the world by the time you're 5th level. And I love that conceit. So that's why it's two of the reasons why it's my favorite.
Yep. Yeah. What I was going to say is that the whole, Lunik, you were talking about LARPing when we used to do a lot of like 3rd edition Mind's Eye Theater. And part of the problem with running a game in those environments is that the game itself not just had setting, it had a prescribed plot about what was happening. So it kind of, we talk a lot about player agency. You didn't have a lot of storyteller agency where you could say, well, I want a game that ignores all of that and is just going off and doing the thing, because you'd have players be like, well, I've got my characters built on the fact that that's happening. What do I do? And it's like, oh, well, okay, I don't know. Like, let's figure this out. So there was a lot of heavy lifting to kind of get out of the bounds of that plot. It was not just setting. It was so integrally tied into the plot, which I think they have fixed in later builds because they've realized how bad that was.
Yeah. And quite honestly, much to what we've been talking about here and much to how they talk about drawing in your players into your game when you're planning an adventure or planning a campaign, that's why I think Shadows of Power worked. What I did is I took that adventure structure or that campaign structure of Mind's Eye Theater. This is a Camarilla city. There are X number of clans that are the standard powerhouses within the city. I said, we have about 100 players in our overall LARP community. I know a lot of really strong players, and I wrote a single character for each player I wanted cast as the primogen of each clan. Done. I wrote all of them. I then wrote the basics, much less information on their number 2. And then I just gave names and a general build the character like X for everybody else. And I planned each clan to have 1 primary, 1 secondary, 1 tertiary, and then 5 or 6 other folks. Yep. I wrote all of that in advance. And then I took every single of the primary, secondary, and tertiary characters and connected them each with a friend in some other clan, an enemy in some other clan, and a secret benefactor from some other clan.
Yep.
Everyone. And then I went out, recruited, and hired all of my players. Yep. And I cast that game for the characters that were written. And that's why it worked. And then I let the whole plot develop based on what the primogen had for their goals, their enemies had for their goals, and then let the players run roughshod over
whatever.
So if you have a really good foundation, you can build off of that. I've ran one of my more successful campaigns. It wasn't a LARP. It was not anywhere near that level, but I did create the characters for the players, which I normally don't do. But I do think that can work. You have to have players who are like, I'm okay with this, but one of the most successful campaigns I ran, I gave them all characters. They all had secret information. They had connecting information. So I'm not saying you should do that, but also it's not taboo. You just talk to your players if you want to do something like that, because it can absolutely work.
It was basically a 1.5 year long session 0 while I was attending other games, learning how to run LARPs. while I wrote this. I was writing characters as I was playing in other games for a year and a half before I said I want to do this, and then got the game going.
Yeah.
With this, I think Greyhawk and any other D&D game can work similarly if you want to go to that level, but on a base level, just 4 or 5 folks sitting at a table.
You don't need to.
Start small, build out. It'd have been great if they called that out more deliberately.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of woven in there, but not as deliberate as I think a book for beginners needs to be.
We were chatting before about why they chose Greyhawk, and I think there's some information that we don't know. I will say that, you know, Forgotten Realms has kind of been the go-to standard setting for many, many years. And then especially now with Baldur's Gate 3 being such a popular game and it too bringing people into the hobby, I would have thought Forgotten Realms would have been an easy, because people now know what Baldur's Gate is. People now know what Illithids or Mind Flayers are, which they exist here too. But, you know, so I thought it was an interesting choice. I have my own theories. I don't know that they're worth spouting because it's just my nonsense. But I think Greyhawk is a fine setting, but it would not have been my choice. But my choice would have been Eberron. So
sure. Well, I think the problem with doing Eberron is that Eberron is a much more specific setting than Greyhawk, right? It's like there are particular aesthetics that define what Eberron is.
Yes.
And so it is. Let's be honest. They chose Greyhawk because there's a lot more possibility for writing books about things that happen in Greyhawk than things that happen in Eberron, right? Eberron would have to be all story based and everything like that. They can't really do a lot of setting books because Eberron's Eberron. You know, I guess they could get like the different continents and stuff like that. They could kind of like get off of.
I have 23rd edition splat books that say you're wrong, but
that's fair. That's fair.
Keith Baker still owns like half that. That's probably why.
Well, that's probably more what it is. Exactly. Yeah. You know, like if they're not going to mention Keith Ammon's book in the last chapter, they're not going to go ahead and make an entire chapter dedicated to Keith Baker's Eberron. So, I think that the placement of the Greyhawk chapter within this chapter is a little weird. To be honest, I think it's worthwhile to go ahead and add the Greyhawk chapter in here. I think its placement is a little weird. I think I would have much rather seen it kind of like with the appendices where it's like there's like an entire appendix dedicated to lore. There's an entire appendix dedicated to how to build maps, like that kind of thing. That's what this feels like more than anything else. It kind of feels a little out of place in this chapter, but you know, especially since it's like longer than the campaign portion of the chapter.
It's almost a full gazetteer of this world,
you know,
which is again fine. I feel
fine.
like it might be too much. Leonika, do you know? Because I'm seeing obviously that Tiamat is from Greyhawk. Is the D&D cartoon? Is that in the world of Greyhawk?
Absolutely.
Yes. That's probably why they're using it then, because there's been that art has been throughout this book. So maybe that's what they're trying to connect back to.
So I am an original Greyhawk player. And did Greyhawk well beyond the existence of Forgotten Realms and was doing it for quite some time. So I have a lot of deep lore knowledge and association with the Greyhawk game. What I can tell you is almost all of the major names in the history of the game, with the exception of Elminster and a few and the Harpers and a few very specific folks, actually got their start here. When we think of Tomb of Annihilation, that was originally a Greyhawk game, and then they changed up a couple things to separate it, so it's now 2 separate places, but that was originally Greyhawk. Saltmarsh, originally Greyhawk.
Interesting. I didn't realize that Saltmarsh was originally Greyhawk. Okay.
Absolutely. So many things that have just in the last 10 years been brought into Forgotten Realms were never Forgotten Realms. It's actually one of the things that I used to gripe about. I'm like, why can't you just call it what it actually was instead of pretending it was in Forgotten Realms all the time? That bothered me, and it gnawed at the grognard in me.
Yeah.
So I think there is an element of putting Greyhawk here and saying once and for all in writing in the modern game, these things originated in Greyhawk, is a nod to those of us who played back at that time. I think there is a fair amount of that with that informs this chapter. But I also think because Greyhawk, even at its most, was never as detailed as Forgotten Realms got. Part of that is the way Ed Greenwood just writes and developed his stories and his characters. Part of that is the amazing work of R.A. Salvatore and all the other great writers on Azure Bonds and all these other wonderful tales that have been told over the years, is that Greyhawk, while it had its novels and it had a lot of detailed stuff, was never done to that level, in my opinion. And they had hundreds of books too, by the way. It just they didn't hit the public gaming lexicon in the same way, and
Right.
part of that is age. Greyhawk came first, and this is when most of us were actually had our own money, so we could go buy all these things.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So because of that, if you're trying to give a new GM, here's a place to have an adventure. Here's a slew of adventure hooks in a spot, so you don't have to worry about maps if you don't not good at maps. But later on, we're going to teach you how to make maps, or you don't have to make NPCs if you're not good at that, because we've got a bunch of them here. Or we'll teach you how to make them. That Greyhawk becomes a better canvas upon which a new GM can paint.
There's more blank spots.
There's more blank spots. There's more room for adventure, and because Greyhawk, very similar to what you're saying with Eberron, says, here's all the past history.
Yep.
And here's where we are today.
Yep.
Everything that follows is your story.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with Forgotten Realms is all that past stuff has forward stuff, and some things have jumped ahead and come back.
Mhm,
Like if you play in any given time in Forgotten Realms and you meet Drist, are you meeting Drist before he had a kid? Are you meeting Drist kids when they're adults and they're adventuring? Are you meeting so-and-so before they become gods? After they become gods? Is this after the spell plague? Before the spell plague? It's a mess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Picking when you're running in Forgotten Realms is a mess, because there will always be a player at your table who's like, I preferred it before this, or I preferred it after this.
I mean, it's like playing in Star Wars. If I play in Star Wars, am I allowed to blow up the Death Star before Luke does? Am I allowed to take Luke's character out? Like, am I allowed to do that, or do we have to stick by canon? So I guess to circle back to what I said earlier, if you want to play in Greyhawk, great, but let your players know that it's your version of Greyhawk, and you do not need to read this entire thing and memorize it before you start. I would say skim it, and if you're like, oh, that's a cool location, then just start there. And then figure out the rest where you as you need to. Don't feel like you have to memorize this entire thing before your first session.
And I will add to that, what is cool about the way that Gazetteer section is set up is you can pick the one spot. I'll use the example, like I gamed in the Yeomanry. I love that area for gaming, right? So if you set your campaign in the Yeomanry, your sessions here, you talk about it, that's awesome. Somebody says, well, I want to come from this. I don't care where we're gaming, but I want to come from this powerful noble house and do all this stuff. Now that player can look at this Gazetteer, or the DM can say, I know where you're from. You're from this place, because all I have to do is read this little paragraph or two, and that matches what you said. So now your character has a home. And if you as a player want to go research that later, we can talk about it as we game, maybe someday in our adventures, because we're all having fun and we might want to go do that, visit your family. A bad guy comes from your town. Now we can adventure there. Again, you're letting your players build out, but you're still starting small. It gives you 20 some odd locations where your players can come from, because they don't all have to come from where your campaign started.
And something like with a cleric, if somebody wants to play a cleric, you don't have to know what every pantheon, what all of them are, but the one that they pick, you probably need to know that one. And if there's like any opposed, maybe that one. But the other 18 or so can figure out as you go along.
Yep.
All right, I'm done. Sorry, Josh, you can move us along.
No, that's perfect. I actually think that's a really nice way to go ahead and bring this one to an end, actually. So that's we'll be again, as we said last time, tell us in your comments down below, what do you think we got right? What do you think we got wrong? What do you think about not just the Greyhawk Gazetteer appearing in the DM's Guild, but what do you think about the general direction of Wizards of the Coast bringing Greyhawk back in a for real way? Maybe eschewing the Forgotten Realms. Who knows? We'll see. But yeah, we'd love to go ahead and hear your comments down below. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. We're going to be pushing out these videos pretty consistently throughout the month here. So keep an eye out on these. We are going to be touching on every chapter here. Obviously, we're up to chapter 5 here. So yeah, please, we'd love to go ahead and hear from you as always.
And just as a personal thing, because I'm a big, huge Greyhawk fan, if you'd like me to use the On the Right Path to talk about any specific area of Greyhawk, or talk more about any of these individual areas, the history, original history, and then what they're doing currently, I'd be happy to expand on that. So let me know. I might do one a month or so, but it'll always be based on listener and viewer participation. So if you ask, I'll deliver.
You might just get it. Yeah. Fun. All right. Thank you all for watching. We'll be back next week, but that's our episode for tonight. So thanks so much for checking out. And yeah, we'll talk to you then. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night, all. Bye.